This is probably a little unique as I'm in a bus driving into a national park in Ecuador. We just, we, if you go to my YouTube channel, I did put a video of us going to a chocolate factory yesterday. And this morning we went to a rose plantation. Anyway, doing a tour of Ecuador and Peru. So, Randy, thank you so much for coming on.
Sure.
When
oh. I don't know whether we're going to be able to keep our today. I hope that we're still broadcasting. If anybody's watching and can confirm that we are and still recording, that would be good. Okay.
Before, what do you think about these?
All right, so I think it's recording even when you're cutting in and out, which you are most definitely doing.
Yep, I have it set up. So if you want to keep going.
Well, it's kind of weird, but I mean, I'm used to being on the radio.
I know you're a good talker, so.
What are you trying to say? I think you're trying to say.
I have a bunch of props and everything.
Yep.
The mountain that
It's just like
colors. The beach guys, sometimes they do like.
So anyway, I'm gonna talk you through this roast. Oh, I gotta wash my hands. Hold on.
But not even, right?
What made you decide to make this?
Because it's one of my most famous
Very small detail.
recipes. I've made this one hundreds and hundreds of times, and everybody loves it. So this is a recipe that I sort of invented, but I will tell you the story about that. Let's talk about the meat first. And by the way, I do have 2 roasts because this takes 3 to 4 hours to cook. And so I have one that I started this morning, and it will be done about the time that this show ends. The most important part is choosing the roast. I have before me a bottom roast. You can get either a top roast or a bottom roast for this. I advise against chuck roast. And the reason is that for this recipe, you need a very dense roast. Chuck roast, while everyone loves how it falls apart when you cook it right, these denser top or bottom roasts are better. Now, when choosing a roast, one of the most important things is this strip of fat along the bottom. That's what I look for. The one that I have right here that's cooking right now has an even thicker strip of fat along the bottom. There's a reason for this. The reason that you want that strip of fat is that it protects. So this is a stovetop roast, and that strip of fat protects the bottom of the roast from scorching or drying out. So the most important part of this is the preparation of the roast before You
Now
start.
you said stovetop. Why stovetop instead of in the oven?
Well, it could be done in the oven in principle, but that's not how I make it. So, I mean, I have made it that way, but I've decided that this is better. So it's the reason it's stovetop is because I think it's better. So, we're gonna spend some time preparing the roast in the pan. The first thing you want to do is just a splash of olive oil. I don't worry about preheating the olive oil in this case, but just a splash of olive oil in the bottom of the pan. And then, because the strip of fat on this particular meat doesn't cover the whole bottom, we're going to do something else. If you've got a piece of meat where the strip of fat covers the whole bottom, you don't have to do this. But what I have is some good-sized champagne steak mushrooms. And I am putting those on the bottom to create a pad for the roast. And now if you have good cookware, as I do, this is probably an unnecessary precaution, and this is going to be cooked on quite low heat. And so you might not absolutely have to do this, but it doesn't hurt anything because mushrooms is very hard to burn them. It can be done, but on the kind of heat that we're going to be using, you're not going to burn the mushrooms. So what you see me doing here is creating a pad for the roast. You can also use celery stalks for this. The difference is that if you use celery stalks, you have to throw those away when you're done because they're not very good if they spend the whole time on the bottom of the roast. But you can use celery stalks for this. So you see that I've made this pad for the roast here, and that's so it won't touch the pan. And those mushrooms will be delicious when we're done. So I'm taking this roast and I'm putting it in the pan on top of the mushrooms. Like I say, if you've got a big enough fat strip, and the one in here right now, the one's cooking on top of the stove right now, did have a big enough fat pad on the bottom of it, so I didn't have to put the mushrooms on that one. I'm going to go on and dump the rest of these mushrooms in here because they go in first anyway. I'll talk about that in a little bit. These are just white mushrooms. They're just champagnes. And I bought the kind that's already sliced. All right. So the preparation, this does not actually take that long to do. The preparation of the roast in the pan is probably, this is where the magic happens. So I am now cutting a slice horizontally across the middle on the side you can't see, but I'll show you on the side you can see in a minute. I'm cutting a horizontal slice, and then above it, another smaller horizontal slice, and I'll show it to you in a moment. I have this knife that is serrated, and it has a hook on the end of it, and so it's good for this purpose. So I'm now going to do one along the top. Going to cut pretty far into the meat. Dear, would you go harvest me some rosemary? I forgot to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make these rather deep slits along the roast. So I need about 5 good-sized pieces. Well, 4 good-sized pieces and 1 small one. The rosemary grows back in our sort of garden room. I got some this morning for the other roast that I'm cooking right now. And so what I have done, I call this wounding the meat. So I've got these strips cut in the beef rather deep, and then on the side you can't see, there are 2 more. Here's a little one and here's a big one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take sprigs of rosemary and I'm going to stuff them into those as soon as my spouse gets back with the rosemary. All right, she's back. I'm going to stuff them into. She can't get by my lights. Let's see. Okay, I need more. I need one more that's at least that big. All right, so I'll do this one first. I always take the stout end and stuff it down in, and then the rest of it goes into this slit, and if there's any left at the end, I either fold it back in or I break it off so that it goes all the way in like that. So stuffing the second one in here. Third one. This one's not quite big enough, so I'm gonna. So I think of this as dressing the wound that I have made. The fourth one is going in. This one wasn't entirely full, so I'm putting a second sprig of rosemary in that. And now I'm going to the other side. Stuffing some rosemary in the wound over there. Now that we have the rosemary stuffed as far into the roast as you can, and somebody might say if you cut a roast like this, it's going to dry out, or at least you're, especially with a dense roast, you're in some danger of it drying out. Almost everything else I'm going to do to this roast is to keep that from happening. Now, this part is going to make people nervous because what I've got is a jar of this minced garlic, and you aren't going to believe how much of it I'm going to put onto this. What I do is I use this minced garlic to dress the wound, and I fill up each cut with something like a heaping teaspoon of garlic. What this does is you think it's going to be too garlicky when it's done, but it's not. Remember that as it cooks, garlic becomes milder and milder, and this thing is going to be cooked for a long time. But what this does is that the garlic releases moisture as it cooks, and you see that I'm sort of healing the wounds by pressing garlic into them. And as much as this looks like it is, this thing is not going to be too garlicky when it's done. Like I say, everything that I'm doing is designed to keep this thing from drying out in the course of cooking. So here's my last teaspoonful of garlic. Well, said it was last, it's not absolutely last. All right. So we now have a wounded but dressed bœuf on our hands. So not sure how well you can see this, but holding it up a little closer to the camera, that's what it should look like. All right. So a word or two about seasoning. I'm going to season the whole thing later. Right at the moment, you can salt it at this particular moment, but you don't have to because I'm going to salt it later. All right, I am now going around the pan with mushrooms. These are actually shiitakes, but it doesn't make that much difference. What you use, actually, this is a mix of shiitakes and champagnes. Doesn't make that much difference what you use. It is, however, important to put, wow, that shiitake's tough. I'm not putting that one in there. It is important that you put the mushrooms in first. There's no need to put more oil. Oil is not really your friend in this regard, except there's no need to put it in the bottom. Except you do need just a little over the top to seal your wounding. All right, just enough to sort of cover it once. This will serve you well because it will also help to keep the beef from drying out. All right, so there we are, and now I'm going to turn the heat on, and I'm going to cover it. I always do it this way because I make the rest of my ingredients. Oh, here we are. While this is beginning to cook, I initially turn the heat, 3/4 of the way up to sort of open everything up and get it in. I'm done with my jar of garlic here, and get it in the mood to receive flavors. I don't need these mushrooms anymore. I'm done with those. All right. Now, the next step is potatoes. And I like these little bags of mixed potatoes. Just going to dump them out on the counter here. Give it a nice variety. You can see about how many I've got. You can have more than that because I have never heard a single person ever say, "Oh, too many potatoes. I don't want so many potatoes." I've never heard that. And so while I cut these, and you want to cut them so that, I think I'm going to turn my board over to the side I haven't used. A little bit of beef juice on that. It's not going to hurt anything because everything's going to be thoroughly cooked, but let's do it that way. When you're cutting the potatoes, you want as much of the potato flesh as you can, and you want little bite-sized potatoes. They're going in the pot with everything else, but like I say, I never heard anybody say fewer potatoes, please. And so I like to cut them so that there's plenty of flesh showing. I don't peel them because everybody knows that most of the nutrients in a potato is in the skin. And I think that peeling potatoes is a silly idea, and I never do it. Just wash them, and you're fine. All right, so a story about this roast beef. I created this recipe, I think, sometime in the early 2000s, and had made it any number of times, and it has a very distinctive flavor. And I'll explain why as we go along, but has a distinctive flavor. And I had made it a number of times, and my spouse and I were in Paris, of all places, eating at a very old and famous family restaurant in Paris. And I ordered the roast beef. The waiter brought it, and I took a bite, and I didn't say anything. I gave my spouse a look, and I said, "Hey, taste this." And she did, and she looked up with basically the same look I had, and she said, "That's your roast beef." And I said, "I know." And so the waiter came back And I asked him, I'm afraid I had to ask him in English, does this roast beef have a name? Is recipe have a name? And he rolled his eyes. He didn't really roll his eyes, but I could tell he wanted to roll his eyes. And he said, Bœuf Provençal, which in French, which I actually do know, but I don't try to speak it, especially not with actual French people. That means country style beef. That's all it means. And he really did want to roll his eyes. In other words, this is absolutely no big deal. This is just how they make roast beef in the country. And I thought, but the combination of spices that I so carefully developed for this. And so shortly thereafter, I discovered this. This is herb de Provence. It's a combination of spices that every French cook knows, and I had recreated it out of my own imagination. And in a way, that's kind of deflating, but in a way, it's sort of nice because I had settled on the blend of spices that all of those good country cooks, in the history of France had settled on. So I'm not gonna take that as being some kind of a failure, but it did make it easier for me to make my roast beef. Whoops, drop the potato. And your guests will never know. Anyway, I'm not putting that in. I'm gonna watch it, then put it. So now, instead of carefully blending the spices, I just go by herb de Provence, and I use it. All right, so we've had our heat up while we were doing this, and you hear that it's making quite a fuss, and you can see that the roast has turned pinkish brown. Now I'm going to cut the heat way back, and I'm going to put all these potatoes in around the edges of the bœuf. They will start to fill up around it. There's nothing unusual about what I'm doing here for roast beef, I'm well aware. But maybe there will be unusual things to follow. In fact, I feel sure you will think there are some unusual things going on. By the way, at about this point, it starts smelling really good in the house. All that garlic and whatnot. So I've now got the potatoes in, and I'm going to cover it again. I'm going to turn it to about halfway up on my gas grill. It depends on your stove. Everybody knows that. All right, then you take a drink of wine, and you go get the carrots. But first, little treasures. So these are those peeled garlic thingies that you can just buy at the store. And I like to put 4 or 5 of these in with the potatoes because they're little, I think of them as little presents or little surprises for people who are eating. They will not do anything to flavor the roast beef, but what they will do is they'll become soft and yummy, and they'll be very mild by the time you eat them. So back to half temperature, maybe a little more than half. Get that going, and now I have carrots. Now, depending on this, I get these peeled baby carrots, and depending on the size of the carrots, I either do or don't cut them. This one is a little too big because the way I think of it is you want to be able to put it in your mouth in one bite. And so I take the ones that are a little bit too big for one bite. They're going to drop a little, but not very much. And I go ahead and I cut them in half, long ways. about this because if they're wet, they can be slippery. I want to cut your hand off. But when I'm thinking about the meal, I always think about, you know, what fits on a fork and the ease of taking a bite. Now, these carrots will be pretty soft when this meal is done, and so it's no difficulty eating one in one bite or getting it on your fork. But these are pretty fat, and so you don't want just one taste in a bite. I'm gonna cut that one the other way because it's a little too skinny for a long ways cut. And so when I think about what fits on the fork, I want the carrots and a potato, or the carrot and, you know, a bit of beef or something like that, as opposed to just eating the carrot. All right, so we're almost there. Oop. I'm just gonna put the carrots in on top of the. There's a reason you put the potatoes second and the carrots third. The potatoes, if you've got enough flesh showing, will take up a lot of the flavor of the juice. The carrots don't take it up as well or as much. And so I put the potatoes in on top of the mushrooms so that they don't stick to the pan, scorch, or anything like that. But also because as this thing cooks, the juice is going to rise in the pan, and I want it to cover the potatoes completely. All right, so I have the, I'll just check to see if I have a flame there. I have the carrots, the potatoes, the mushrooms, and the beef all in there, and they're warming up. I've got some more stuff I need to do, but now is the moment when I season it. So I'm going to take my garlic salt. I always use that because I find that it is milder than regular salt. It adds a little bit of flavor. You can use a lot of it without getting things too salty. And as you see, I'm being extremely generous with the garlic salt. And I'm salting both the meat and the carrots. And of course, it'll work its way down into the potatoes and the mushroom. Done with the garlic salt. Pepper. I like to use this mignonette pepper that you can get from Penzeys, but you can't use very much of it because it's pretty strong. But I find it to be better than ordinary black pepper, so you see it didn't use very much. But and the same would be true if you just have your regular black pepper. Then, having done that, you take a drink of wine and you move to your herbs de Provence. Now you say, I don't have this in my kitchen. You can find them at most grocery stores, maybe you don't, but you have something very similar, which is Italian seasoning. It is very similar, but it's not quite the same. I'm not sure. I should have looked it up what the difference is, but if you want to just use Italian seasoning, that works just fine. When I made the herbs de Provence, the combination of spices that I used is generous in most part. Dried basil, dried oregano, dried thyme, dried powdered fennel. That might be one of the more important ones. And one more. Tarragon. So that's the mix. I don't know what they put in this one because they don't say on the label, but there's a distinctive taste that herbs de Provence has. Remember, this beef already has rosemary in it, but the rosemary is deep down inside the beef, and you will be able to taste it. Anyway, I am now going to generously put the herb de Provence on everything here. The beef is gurgling nicely at the moment. And closing up my herb de Provence. And now it's time for the onion. The function of the onion, apart from onioning the thing, the function of the onion is to contribute to keeping the roast from drying. And so I'm going to do something with it that is a little unusual, I think, but I do this, those of you who have watched my salmon show have seen what I do with an onion with the salmon, and I use it for the same function, which is to keep the salmon from drying out. So it's the way I cut it and how I put it in. The onion will cook anyway, no matter what you do, and it does not contribute much more to the flavor of this thing than it will if you're eating the onions along with your roast beef. And so there's no reason why the onion needs to be deep down inside. Now, when I would do the salmon, I cut this onion into strips that are a bit thinner than the ones I'm going to use for roast beef. So I cut it kind of thick, and you'll see why shortly. Do the other one, if the whole onion is going in there. These fat strips of onion, the ones that are on the top, these are going to be used as a layer on top of the beef to keep it from drying out. So I am going to make a blanket of big fat onion strips over the top of this beef. And you're going to say that doesn't make any difference, and I would say you're wrong. It does. This is something I have tested over and over, and I am convinced that the layer of onions really helps hold moisture in your meat. And that's true whether it's fish or beef or whatever you're making. The trick is to have enough surface. They'll cook and they'll be delicious to eat when you're done. But their main function here is not seasoning, it is moisture. You don't need to put seasoning on top of them, but I think that they do help the seasonings underneath sort of adhere and sink in to the meat. In my opinion, it's probably impossible to get too many. Well, I guess if you put 10 onions in here, it's certainly not going to negatively affect your outcome because you could always pull them off. All right, about done with this part. So as you can see, I have a thick blanket of fat onions on top of the beef. All right, so I have these pieces left. I just throw them in. There's no reason not to eat them, no reason not to cook them. I just throw them in with the carrots and whatnot. They will be yummy later. Now, this one doesn't want to come apart. All right. Now you would think that we might be done here, but we're not. And the reason is moisture. So the last stage of preparing this is you take a bunch of cilantro. It does not have to be cilantro because you're not going to eat this anyway. You can use spinach, you can use parsley, anything that is moist. And what I am now going to do is cover the entire roast with this cilantro. And then I'm going to put the lid on, and then I'm going to cook it for 3 to 4 hours. The cilantro, when we're done, I'll show you in a second because there's a roast that's done on the other burner. The cilantro, you pull it off. You don't need to eat that. It doesn't taste good anyway, and so there wouldn't be any reason to eat it. Let me get this onion mess out of my way. All right, we are pretty close to being done here. And I'm going to do the reveal, I guess they call it. Is that what they say about it? And pull the other roast off. The other roast is much smaller. And now we're going to have more roast than we know what to do with in my household. However, I have noticed that this roast disappears pretty fast. Sometimes it doesn't even last till a second day, even when I have a lot of it. So the next thing you do is take a drink of wine. And then you get your other roast. Pretty sure it's done. It has been cooking since this morning. Pretty heavy, pretty hot. All right. Turn off the stove. And here we have a finished roast. So the next thing I do is remove the cilantro. It's hot, so I'm going to use some tongs. If I can find any. Here's some. Try not to get the onions because you want to eat those. All right. Get my meat fork. The onions aside. The rosemary that's down in there has stems, and so I usually try to remove as much of that as I can, and then I warn the guests. So here's some. Then I warn the guests that they may get a stick if they're not careful. Okay, this is not as tender as it's going to be. This needs another, I would say another hour. And I am going to put it back on here in a minute, but obviously you want to see what this looks like. And there it is. Looks pretty yummy, and it will be pretty yummy. So I'm actually going to pile everything back up on top of it and put it back on the burner and give it another hour at least. With this top and bottom style roast, it never gets to the point that it's falling apart. This is a very dense cut of meat. And so if you want the roast that's falling apart, get yourself a chuck roast. That's not what this does. What this does is it becomes tender, but it still has a good bit of resistance. And frankly, that's just the way my wife likes it. I have made chuck roast and it was just falling apart, so soft, and asked her, you know, you want me to make it that way? And she said, no. I like the dense. And so ever since then, and that wasn't that long ago, ever since then, that's how I've continued to make it. And with that, we're pretty much done. In terms of heat, when everything is done as it is with the one that we just prepared, I cut it back to about 1/4, maybe to 1/3 of the amount of heat that your burner has. And you just leave it alone. You don't have to stir it. You don't have to do anything. You just leave it alone. Go away and come back in 3 or 4 hours and see what you've got, like I sort of just did with this. And this one I'm putting back on. Very important to keep it covered, because if you don't keep it covered, it will dry out. This dense meat dries out if you're not careful. And with that said, I'm pretty much done. So let me see if I can look up the camera. So, I realize you're off in Ecuador and you can't stop the show, but for anybody who's watching this, thanks for stopping by. Make yourself some roast beef. Write me or write R and tell me how it came out. I'm quite confident that if you do what I did, it's going to come out delicious. All right, so with that said, I'm going to stop the recording.